All right, the third method to solve quadratics is called completing the square. Now, there's a fancy visual model if you want to go on YouTube and look up a model of completing the square, and it'll tell you why it's called that, but we're not going to get into that right now. So, completing the square is my least favorite method. It is arguably the most complicated, but it always works. So if you're forced to use one and you need it to work, factoring doesn't work, you can't take the square root. Completing the square is the way that you're going to be able to do or solve the problem. So completing the square has quite a few steps. So the first step says to rearrange the equation so it's in the form of x squared plus bx equals negative c. Now, this negative just really means the opposite. So it's the opposite of what c was. So to get that, you're going to take your original equation and set it equal to 0. So if it was, say, x squared plus 3x plus 10, and I'm just going to set it equal to 0. Okay, second, I'm going to subtract c, which is this 10, to bring it to the other side. So I'm subtracting because it's the opposite of that. So if I were to do that, I'd have x squared plus 3x and then subtract 10. Now I have opposite side is negative 10. Okay? One side note, if a, so the number out front here, is not 1, so if there's a number out front there, you have to divide everything by a. So if this was 2, you'd have to divide everything by 2. If it's 10, you have to divide everything by 10, which means it can get messy really fast. Okay, if I had to divide this by 2, now instead of 3, I'm using 1.5. Okay, again, it's a complicated method, why it's not my favorite. So, second step, this is saying find b over 2, that whole thing squared. Now, this is just a representation of saying take whatever b value is, so in this case it'd be 3, I would divide it by 2 and then square it. Okay, so I'm going to pick an easier number. Let's say b is 8. So I would take 8 divided by 2, which is 4, and then I take 4, square it, and I get 16. Okay, so this value here, this 16, is our b squared divided by 2, or b divided by 2 squared. Okay, so this number is going to be important. So we're going to complete the square by adding our value from step 2 to both sides of the equation. Okay, so if this was 16, I would add 16 to this side and to this side. Okay, fourth step, it says I need to factor it. Okay, so what we did in the first method, we're going to have to do it again here. So we're going to factor it. Now, this factoring is not actually going to be difficult. There's a pattern that you're going to follow every time. Okay, it's going to be the format of x, and then there's going to be a plus or minus here depending on what it is, and then it'll be the number squared. So like in this case here, 8 divided by 2 was 4. So this number here, before I squared it, it would be that same number. So it'd be that number there, and if this was positive, so let's say that b was positive 8, this is going to be a plus. If it was negative 8, it's going to be a minus. So x plus 4 squared, okay? So this factoring, don't think too hard about it. It should be pretty simple. Okay, second, step 5, like we did before with square roots, we're going to do the square root of both sides. So if I had this, I would take the square root of x plus 4, and then whatever equals, I'm going to take the square root of that as well. Okay, and then step 6, write the two equations. So I'm going to actually have to solve two equations like we did with factoring, but after I take the square root. All right, so going through this, there are a couple ways they can ask you questions. So the first one, in example 1, it says, what value of c makes y equals x squared plus 18x plus c a perfect square trinomial? So this is a way they can ask you, do you know how to complete the square without telling you to solve it? So they're just asking you, what value of c do I plug in here to make it a perfect square trinomial? Okay, so to figure this out, they're just asking what value would you add to both sides. So if I look here, okay, I have 18 there. Well, to get my c value, the value I add to both sides, I would do my b divided by 2 squared. So in this case, 18 divided by 2 is 9, and 9 squared is 81. So my answer for c, 81, is my value for c that I would add to both sides. Okay, and then by doing that, it will become a perfect square trinomial. So pause the video, try practice 1. So what value of c makes your next equation a perfect square trinomial? All right, for practice 1, so we have y equals x squared minus 14x plus c, and I want it to be a perfect square trinomial. So again, b over 2 squared. Well, this time b is negative 14, okay, divided by 2, which is negative 7. But when you do negative 7 squared, you still get a positive answer. So your answer here should be 49. So 49 is C. All right. Other way they can ask you for completing the square says to find the solutions of y equals 2x squared minus 16x plus 22. When it asks you to find the solutions, you're going to have to go through the whole process. So my first step, I need to rearrange this so that it's in the format that it was listed above. Okay, so to do that, first I'm going to set it equal to 0. Okay, if you don't like the 0 on the left, just rewrite it on the right. We don't need that y equals, that's where 0 is. So I have, I'm going to write over here, 2x squared minus 16x plus 22 equals 0. Okay, so I need to now subtract this 22 so it goes over to the other side. So I have 2x squared minus 16x. Now I have nothing there anymore, so it's equals negative 22. Okay? Now, there was that little side note under step 1. It says if a is not equal to 1, okay, then you must divide everything by a. Well, a is 2 here, so I have to divide everything by 2. So if I divide everything by 2, I end up with x squared minus 8x equals negative 11. Okay, so I divided everything by 2. Now, the next step, notice I left a little blank here. If it helps you, draw a line so you can remember that you need to add something to both sides. So I drew a blank and a blank on both sides of the equal sign. This is where I'm going to put that b divided by 2 squared. So I have negative 8, and I'm going to divide that by 2, which is negative 4, square it, which is positive 16. Okay, so divided by 2, I end up with half of 8, which is 4. 4 squared is 16. So I have to add 16 to both sides. Okay, now this right side, I can just combine together. So negative 11 plus 16 is 5. So over here where I have some room, I want to write that it equals 5. On the left side here, the x squared minus 8x plus 16 is going to become my perfect square trinomial, or it is a perfect square trinomial. It's going to become whatever this binomial is squared. Okay? Like I said before, you don't have to think too hard about what it is. So it's always going to be x, and then what number was it before we squared? It was -4. So x minus 4 squared equals 5. So now my fifth step here, it says take the square root of both sides of the equation. So just like we did with square roots, take the square root of both sides. I end up with x minus 4, okay, that was what's inside, equals square root of 5. Okay, and then remember, taking the square root makes it positive or negative. So I can put the plus or minus. Now, to get my final answer, I have to add 4 to both sides. Okay, I'm actually going to put this out front, so I kind of wrote it underneath for now. So it's going to look like x equals, and then this positive 4 plus or minus the square root of 5. It looks really messy, but don't worry, it's the right answer. So 4 plus or minus the square root of 5. This is saying 4 add the square root of 5 or 4 subtract the square root of 5. Okay, again, this method is really complicated. The answer gets complicated depending on the numbers, but it works every time. So pause the video, try your best at practice 2, see how far you can get. All right, for practice 2, so it asks what are the zeros. That's the same as the solutions. So we have to go through this whole process. So I'm going to set it equal to 0 first. Okay, I don't need to divide anything, but I do need to move this 8 over to the other side. So x squared minus 6x, again, I'm leaving a space, equals 8, space. Half of 6 is 3. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. 3 squared is 9. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. 8 plus 9 is 17. X squared minus 6x plus 9. If I factor that out, x, okay, before I squared it, it was 3, and it was minus. So minus 3. X minus 3 squared equals 17. Take the square root of both sides. I get x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 17. Finally, add the 3, and my final answer becomes x equals the 3 that I added plus or minus the square root of 17. Okay. All right, last example. So if you turn your page, we have find the solutions. X squared plus 4x equals 3. Now, you might be tempted to bring that 3 over, like what we'd have to do for factoring, but that 3 actually already needs to be on that side. So don't do it. If we're going through, okay, we have the x squared plus 4x equals 3. So my suggestion, rewrite it, leave yourself some space, and go through. So pause the video again, see how far you can get. All right, so let's go through this practice. So again, we didn't need to do anything. So x squared plus 4x, I'm leaving a space, equals 3, space. Take half of the 4, which is 2. So 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 squared is 4. So I really just need to add 4 to both sides. 3 plus 4 is 7. X squared plus 4x plus 4 becomes x plus 2. Again, that before you square it is your number. X plus 2 squared. Okay, step 5, square root both sides. I end up with x plus 2 equals square root of 7. Okay, and it has to be plus or minus. Sorry, that looks like plus plus. Plus minus, subtract 2. Subtract 2. Now, this time, we subtracted the minus 2 here. When we put it out front, it just becomes minus 2 plus or minus the square root of 7. Okay, and that is how we complete the square.